Okay, so we're going to take a little look at single joint profiles. I know previously how I spoke about we go through a movement, we go from a position of weak, strong, weak as we come through, but actually there's some subcategories where we can start to divide joint motions a little bit. 3 we're going to look at, we've got single joint profiles with a small range of motion, single joint profiles with a large range of motion, and then the third one is single joint profiles where we've got predominance of 2 joint muscles. So the key thing here to remember is we're looking at joint motion and not exercise. Exercise will come into occasion very, very soon. Hold out on that, that's coming soon. But this moment in time, just think of a joint motion. So remember, when we're looking at strength, we're looking at our internal strength production. So each one of these we're going to look through and almost try to have a depiction of how our strength is throughout different joint motions. So whether it's shoulder abduction, scapular retraction, hip abduction, spinal movements, spinal flexion, spinal extension, ankle plantar flexion, and knee extension, each one of them goes to a relatively small range of motion when we compare that in a minute to shoulder horizontal flexion or horizontal adduction on there. So when we go through a small range of motion, we actually go from a position of relatively strong to weak. So these go from a strong to weak profile. So they might not start at their strongest point, but they are going to start a lot stronger than definitely they finish. So they might not start right at the top here and go directly strong to the weak, but they're going to start at a stronger point, and there may be a little bit of strength increase as we go through the movement, and then gradually it's going to drop off. Take that abduction there. The bottom part down here, if you can see my cursor, there might be a slight drop in torque in that bottom point, but then it gradually gets a bit stronger straight away, and then gradually get weaker as we go through the movement. And that's the same with scapular retraction. Not sure if you can see my image, I think that one's moving on there. Hip adduction or abduction, spinal flexion, stroke extension, ankle plantar flexion, knee extension. And from a practical point of view, we can think each one of these is almost easier to play with, easier to set up, because we can think, okay, later on when we come to play with this, we'd want to set something up that goes from heavy to light, because we're going strong to weak. And these small range of movement, as we can see there, are more common than we think. Straight away, we always previously think that, okay, everything goes from a position of weak, strong, weak. But when it comes to practical application from a joint motion perspective, we actually do have more bias towards a strong to weak position. The second single joint motion I mentioned was a single joint with a large range of motion. Where in these, we do go from a position of weak to strong to weak as we go through the movement. 2 key ones here to think is shoulder horizontal adduction and abduction, and then shoulder flexion and extension. Think of the range of motion we go through on them compared to pure abduction. Think of the range of motion we go on them compared to ankle, maybe plantar flexion on there. The key thing that's almost going to prevent these large range of motion single joint profiles, whether we go from actually a weak to strong to weak position, is a couple of points. 1, in the name itself, we go through a large range of motion. Self-explanatory on that one. 2, would we see a large change in the intramuscular moment arm changes? So internally in the joint, when we're maybe looking at the pecs mechanics, when we go from that bottom position to the mid position to the short position, or should I say lengthen, mid to short, and as we go through there, the internal moment arm to the pec is going to go through a large change. So we're going to see a large muscular internal moment arm change as we go from a lengthen range to a mid range to a short range. And there's also going to be a big bias, a big change within length tension as well. So if we've got large range of joint motion, large range of internal moment arm changes, and bigger sort of length tension changes, then we're going to go from this weak to strong to weak position. I would say once we get to practical application, you are going to find that there's not the same weakness in a sense in the lengthened compared to the shortened. So the question almost you want to ask is at each end of the movement, how weak are we? Do we start in a position maybe where we're almost up here, we gradually get stronger in the midpoint, and then we start to really drop off the cliff and drop off there? Or are you someone maybe who's a bit of a plateau in that mid position, and then suddenly it just goes boom, drops off? So you actually hold your strength throughout a good range, and then maybe you get back to this end point sort of back here, and it just drops off on there. So again, these graphs are just about trends. They're not about absolutes. Some people will be more flatter and then drop off. Some people will say have more of a peak on there. So there might be a certain midpoint in there, and that's going to be so many individual differences on there. But there is going to be, as I say, that trend where we start a little bit weaker, we definitely get stronger as we go through it, and then we definitely drop off and get weaker on there. The third single joint profile is a joint motions where we go through, we've got a predominance of two joint muscles. So for instance, if we look at knee flexion on there, we can say we've got 3.5 hamstrings. In a sense, we've got 4 hamstrings, but we've got 3 who cross the knee and the hip, and obviously the short head of the biceps femoris, which only crosses the knee, in a sense doesn't go over the hip as well. So there's a predominance, 3 out of 4 muscles, which are across 2 joints, across the knee and the hip. So where we've got single joint profiles, knee flexion here, we're looking at where we've got a predominance of muscles which cross the 2 joints, we're going to go from a profile that potentially may start weaker, but if we're in extended hip position like you see here, we're going to go strong to weak. So we almost go back to that single joint profile we saw initially with a short range of motion, where we start strong and we go weak. Looking at elbow flexion here, if we start in that mid position, there in a flex shoulder and then come through to that flexed elbow position, we are going to almost drop off a cliff as we start to maybe come to this type of position. Elbow extension as well. So again, from a practical application point of view, from a setup perspective, each one of them may be relatively easier to work with because you just want to try and have a setup which goes from heavy to light. Again, as we've gone from a position of strong to weak. The biggest influence here is going to be the secondary joint position. Hip position, shoulder position, shoulder position. When I say secondary, I don't mean less importance at all. I just mean the one that's ideally not moving on there. You will see a lot of people start to move the hip when they're doing obviously hamstring curls, knee flexion work. We know that, but the ideal, the goal here is generally to keep that secondary joint stable when we're moving that primary joint on there. So I say, if we're working in position in the shorter end, then we're going to go from that weak to strong. But if we were to be in a position where we're flexed through the hip, flexed through the shoulder, elbow flexion, extended through the shoulder, elbow extension, we're going to be more of this mid part here. May not like the shoulder abduction movements where we're going through that weak, strong, weak movement. We may not go fully weak in that length position all the way down to fully weak in the short position. We're going to stay somewhere along this top part of the curve, but it's going to trend in a similar way where we're going to be a bit weaker, definitely get stronger, and then definitely drop down and get even weaker there. You will start to find with fatigue, with practical application on there, they end up being a lot stronger in the weak position. Like we said on the initial thing where we're looking at sort of joint profiles and strength profiles on there, that when fatigue comes into play, we do get a big drop off on there. But in a similar way that when it comes to practical application, like we saw, or like I mentioned on here, is how much of a drop in one end do we get? I know for myself, practically through knee flexion, in this flexed hip position, in that extended knee, I hold my strength a lot in the mid-range, and then suddenly it gets over here and then just boom, almost just drops off a cliff as I get 0 degrees knee extension, or even say 5 degrees of knee flexion stroke just in that start position. I've got a tiny knee bend there, you can see. At that sort of point, I start to just go boom. But then I drastically increase in strength. I sort of hold that strength as I go through the movement. Then as I get sort of to 90 degrees of knee flexion, joint position would be a mid-joint position. As I get 90 degrees knee flexion, then it boom, starts to drop off there quite drastically on there. So again, it's not necessarily going to be an even weak, strong week as we go through it, but it's still going to trend in that matter as we go through the movement. It's going to be a little bit stronger in the mid-range, then gradually start to drop off as we go through it. But it's trying to have an idea, again, of what's that secondary joint position and where within almost this graph, where are you going to be working? Are you going to be working more through shorter range movements? Are you going to be working through longer range movements? Or should I say joint motions? Just as a side point to finish here, I use different images in terms of, because I couldn't find obviously the joint motions like I had done previously on there when I came to look at obviously a flexed shoulder compared to an extended shoulder as we're going through elbow flexion. Obviously I wasn't able to find them images on there. So I say, again, try and forget about the exercises, think about the joint motions in terms of elbow flexion, whether it's with a flexed shoulder or extended shoulder, elbow extension, whether it's with extended shoulder, flex shoulder, knee flexion, whether it's with extended hip or flexed hip. where within this range, or are you somewhere in the middle? In a sense, are you working? Is it more in that lengthened position where we're stretching the muscle from both ends? Is it more in that shortened position where the muscle's getting shortened from both ends?